Karmanos Cancer Health Equity Book Club. This is the first time that we're meeting in person and virtually. So we're going to figure out the choreography of this, but I think we're on task. So we've been meeting quarterly since October of 2020. Our goal is to educate health professionals and trainees about the impact of structural racism in the medical care system and to provide a forum for dialogue between health professionals, academics, trainees, and community members. This event is coordinated under the auspices of the KCI Office of Cancer Research, Training, and Education. And I would like to thank Dr. Morhaf Al-Ashkar, our new Associate Center Director for Education, and Danny Inman, Program Coordinator, for their support. I would also like to acknowledge the collaboration and sponsorship of the Department of Public Health at Wayne State University and the Michigan Association of Genetic Counselors, otherwise known as MAGC. So today I'm going to keep my introductions very intentionally short to provide maximum time for discussion. We're honored to welcome our colleague and author, Dr. Lou Penner, who will be presenting highlights from his book, Unequal Health, Anti-Black Racism and the Threat to America's Health. This will be followed by comments from our three panel members, who I will introduce, or actually, I'm sorry, we unfortunately just have two panel members. Today, I will introduce at the time and then an open discussion. All two panel members have served previously in our book club. So, Dr. Penner, Lou, he's a friend and a colleague. He's professor emeritus of oncology at Wayne State and served on faculty for 18 years. Among his many accomplishments, he is past president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. His research focuses on causes of racial health disparities, and he was among the first to focus on implicit racial bias. Actually, I might just add, it's kind of a unique position to have been a subject in that research, as well as a collaborator in their research. So, Dr. Penner, please take the podium.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to start a timer because I was telling Danny that I tend to be incredibly enamored with the sound of my own voice, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time. So let me begin. First of all, I'd like to introduce my co-authors. And the thing I want to tell you about the co-authors is that Detroit and KCI is all over this book. Jack DeVideo is at Yale, but from the first year that I arrived at KCI, Jack was the person I called because I could see the overlap between the important theoretical work that Jack had been doing on the nature of racial bias and the work that I wanted to do here. That picture of me is not an imitation of Donald Trump's mugshot, but I've had two of my friends suggesting that. I was squinting into the sun, okay? Now Hagawara, some of you know, was a postdoc here for 3 years and has recently been appointed as a professor of public health services at the University of Virginia Medical School. Brian Smedley is an equity scholar at the Urban Institute. Brian was the editor of the book Unequal Treatment, which really changed the whole picture about studying inequities in medicine. He also has a Detroit connection. His mother, Audrey Smedley, was in the anthropology department here, and his godfather is Charles Wright, as in the Charles Wright Museum. So Detroit is really a part of this book. So let me begin. I'm, with two exceptions, I'm not going to read these quotes. These are only to give you something to read while I'm talking. The first point that we make is something which I presume, because you're here, you already know, and I just want to give you and perhaps the people on Zoom a little basis for this. Relative to white Americans, Black Americans live about 6 years less. They are much more likely to have premature deaths, that is, dying before 75. They have a higher incidence of and are more likely to die from most diseases, especially the most serious diseases, cancer and heart disease. They have 2 to 3 times higher maternal and infant mortality rate. I'm not going to talk about anything that wasn't in the book, but there's been a lot of stuff in New York Times and other things recently about the difficulties of Black women in maternity, and the death rate and mortality rate is much higher. On average, they receive less aggressive and appropriate treatments for almost all illnesses, cancer being very clearly one of them. And that was originally one of the things that made me start thinking and eventually writing. And they typically have poorer interactions for medical interactions with non-Black physicians. And this is work that people like Susan Egley and Lauren and Felicity were collaborators. And then once they got rid of me, continued. I should also mention Lorna working on this. This is a large focus of the communication behavioral oncology. So why? Why do these differences exist? Well, the book's core thesis is that a root cause of racial disparities in health and healthcare is anti-Black racism. Now, by the way, some people have gotten confused and they thought that this was being opposed to Black racism. One of my former colleagues wrote me, that's not, this is anti-Black racism. Maybe there's supposed to be a comma or something there. The core thesis of the book is that it affects Black Americans' health and healthcare via three interrelated paths. These paths are not unique. One is the chronic stress that is produced by exposure to racial discrimination, which initiates physiological processes that endanger their health. And I'm going to talk about each one of these paths as we go through it. Segregated and under-resourced neighborhoods, which contain numerous threats to the residents' health. It's important that I make it, no one's suggesting that these neighborhoods are inherently pathological. There's many strengths to these neighborhoods, but because of the nature of racial segregation in the United States, there are environmental factors in this which jeopardize the health of the people who live in it. And finally, less access to healthcare and poor quality healthcare, which obviously endangers the health of Black patients. So why? So Dr. Powell and I were talking about this before. Is it biological or racial differences? Well, of course, genetics, heredity, and other biomedical factors obviously play an important role in health. There are genetic and inherited diseases, and some diseases are more prevalent in certain population groups than others. And I believe that Dr. Powell will be talking somewhat about that in his comments. But the term race has no biological or genetic meaning. It is a social construct. It describes how people are socially identified. It's a term that's long been discarded by biologists and geneticists. And there's more genetic heterogeneity within groups labeled as Black and white than there is between them. 99% of the genome overlaps, okay? And as I said, Dr. Powell's gonna be talking about some of this later. So one of the things that well, I'll give you a little bit of digression here. So saying modestly, we were in the forefront of identifying implicit bias as a cause of health disparities. And when I approached my primary collaborator, Jack DeVio, Jack and I have been writing together for 40 years. And then we recruited Nao Hagawara, who is a former postdoc, and then we convinced Brian Smedley to do this. I mean, this is going to be easy. You know, we know all about implicit bias. And we'll just write, and then I was kind of the lead, would do the first drafts, and then it was like watching, I don't know, this very complicated flower unfold, and not a pretty flower. We realized that there was so much more that we had to talk about to make our case. And at the core of our argument is racism. Racism is the idea that white people and Black people are different, and the former is superior to the latter. One of the things that we had to address there is clearly the United States of 2023 is not the United States of 1963 and certainly not 1863. But despite these changing norms and these legal prohibitions, racism and racial discrimination has shown remarkable persistence. So one of the things we had to address, actually, and devoted a whole chapter to it, is why has it persisted? If race is not biological, why has it persisted? Well, one of the things we know is that race and racism has been an integral part of American history and culture since its founding. It's interesting that compared to other countries, the white colonial settlers gave much more emphasis to race than in other colonial territories where people take it, that race was a much more important identifier in North America. This would be above the British, okay? So it's an integral part of culture since the United States founding, or before United States founding, okay? Begins, as you know, the important work, 1619, it begins with the forced importation of 14 Black Africans in 1619. So what is it rooted in? First of all, it's rooted in bad science. There was a movement that began in ancient Greece and extended until the 1930s and 1940s, which is called scientific racism. The core thesis of scientific racism was that Black people and white people are genetically different. They are, in the words of Carl Linnaeus, the founder of taxology, taxology, that's what I'm saying, classification of species, and some other people who might surprise you, Voltaire, Thomas Jefferson. I could list these major figures in 16th through 20th century science who believed that they usually refer to them as Ethiopians, interestingly. I have no idea why, but they were less moral, slower, etc. Every racist myth that you could think of was embedded in these theories, okay? Obviously, then we have the long history of enslavement and subjugation of Black Americans. Subjugation of Black Americans did not end with the end of slavery. We had almost 100 years of essentially Jim Crow laws in the United States. And Jim Crow laws were not confined to the traditional South, okay? And so with that enslavement and subjugation, there was a need to justify it and to assign to Black Americans traits that would justify their enslavement, okay? A very quick example, there was a United States census that claims that the incidence of mental illness among free slaves was significantly higher than it was among people who were enslaved. And there are a number of other things like that. So there were these historical features that were part of the persistence. Slavery ends, we move into the 20th century, but one of the things that persisted throughout this is how human beings process information about the world around them and the people they encounter. We have a whole half chapter on this. Let me just try to summarize very quickly. Our evolutionary ancestors were puny. They didn't run very fast. They weren't very strong. So how'd they survive? They survived because they were smarter, okay? And they developed cognitive mechanisms that enabled them to deal with the world better. For example, they developed the ability to create schema, which is understand and predict the world around them. So it was a major advantage when we became agricultural, because they could predict harvests. They knew when they should harvest, when they should bring in the crop. So human beings process information about the world around them, the people they encounter, in a way that makes it more likely that they will form racial stereotypes. They will also see conflict and between people of different groups, okay? And finally, certainly in the early 20th century, there was the cultural transmission of racial stereotypes in movies, in commercials. If anybody's ever seen Birth of a Nation, okay, it makes your skin crawl. It's about the glorious Ku Klux Klan saving white Southern womanhood from the ravages of animalistic Black people, okay? And then there were also commercials, and some of the only recently. So all of this is part of the history, but certainly with regard to the psychological and cognitive processes or any of this, there's nothing natural or automatic about racism. Racism is not an inherent policy. Most of the time the humans evolved, there were no racial differences between people. The evolution of race is a relatively recent phenomenon in human evolution. So what we propose in the book is that anti-Black racism is manifested in two types of racial bias. They're interconnected. They're not distinct. One is systemic racial bias, which is well-established social norms, cultural values, informal practices that do harm to Black Americans. Now, some of these were structural and legal: slavery, Jim Crow. Those were laws, okay? And then this also led to things like the segregation of public facilities and schools, public facilities, and medical care. Now, for someone my age, this is a recent event. For some of you, it won't be. But it wasn't until the 1960s that these things were declared illegal with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And the fact is that they were very slow to change in fact, okay? So segregation was certainly a part of my reality growing up, okay? And then part of systemic racism, which is perhaps the most insidious part, is that there are institutional practices, and they have acquired a certain inertia that disadvantage Black people. For example, there is chronic underfunding of hospitals, forget a drink of water, that predominantly treat Black patients. There's no evidence that someone said, let's underfund those. But the nature of social and economic disparities in the United States and the way things are funded has created a dramatic difference between the financial resources, the quality of care of hospitals that predominantly treat African American patients and white patients. And here's the thing: racist intentions are not necessary for systemic racism to occur, okay? It's more an inertia that we've done that. We're going to come back to that when I talk about systemic racism in medicine in a little while. And then there's individual racism. These are personal thoughts and feelings that do harm to Black Americans. There's explicit or overt bias. This is, I'm saying things that I know are racist or that I know are derogating Black people. There's nothing implicit about this. There's nothing hidden about it, okay? You know, or I'm saying things that may have a cover. I'll give you an example, I suspect. Just look at what Governor DeSantis is doing with the anti-woke thing. Someone finally said what needed to be said. He's not anti-woke, he's anti-Black, okay? But some of these is the person knows what they're doing. There's nothing implicit about it. And then there's implicit bias, which is automatic or largely unconscious negative feelings in response to a Black person. And an editorial note: people are too quick to label a lot of explicit bias and implicit. Well, the person didn't know what they were doing. They knew damn well what they were doing. Okay, so those are the two forms of bias that I'm going to talk about. But let's go to the first path. Remember, in the book, there's three paths. The first path is the physiological effects of exposure to racial bias and discrimination. For those of you that are longtime residents of Detroit, you'll notice the quote we use here. Nobody knows exactly when he said it, but given it was Coleman Young, you know, for sure he said it, okay? So let me give you some quick background. Most of you probably know about the general adaptation syndrome, but how humans adapt to stress, okay? When humans experience threat or frustration or experience some form of stress, their bodies are energized, okay? That's represented by things like increased blood sugars, cortisol, oxygen. And what that does is it gives them the ability to either confront the stressor or get away from the stressor, okay? We need energy. If these reactions are effective, stress is gone. The body returns to calm, or what's called homeostasis. Responses to chronic stress are different, okay? If the stress can't be removed, the body is chronically energized and results in allostatic load, or more accurately, allostatic overload, which is the physiological wear and tear that results from the inability to achieve calm homeostasis. The body is essentially continually activated, and the body pays the price for that. So when we look at chronic stress and allostatic load, first thing, and this is important to everything I'm going to say today, there is no process that we describe in the book that, in terms of the underlying, the things that underlie process, is unique to people, to Black Americans. These processes that we describe occur for anybody, okay? There's nothing physiologically unique about Black Americans that produce these results, okay? Indeed, in the book, it says, first thing is experiencing discrimination is a stressor for all people. And we cite several studies that show that in white populations, people who report they've experienced discrimination show the same medical effects. So there's nothing unique about this, except for the fact that Black Americans are much more likely to experience racial discrimination, and they view it as something they confront, the majority of them, that they confront daily and they really can't get away from. Thus, a large percentage of them are chronically activated or allostatic overload. This is measured, by the way, again, I think I'm probably telling people know, this is measured by various biomarkers, cortisone levels, epinephrine, blood pressure, a lot of other things like that. At every age, Black Americans show higher levels of allostatic load than do white Americans. This is the work of Arlene Geronimus, who is a distinguished epidemiologist at the University of Michigan. And Arlene, I don't know her, so I'll call her Dr. Geronimus, was the person who popularized the idea of weathering. And that is that the toll of racial discrimination on Black Americans is akin to a roof that gets weathered. It gets worn down, okay? And what this shows is from her work done in the early 2000s, is looking at the difference in allostatic load between Black Americans and white Americans over the lifespan. And this doesn't need a lot of explanation. Starting in about the mid-20s, Black Americans experience significantly higher allostatic load than do white Americans throughout their lives, okay? What's the consequences of that? Well, there are multiple illnesses involving metabolic systems such as hypertension, heart distress, and diabetes. There are problems with the immune system. And again, we go into a lot more detail on this. I'm just trying to give you the highlights, but you can show both immune deficiencies and then autoimmune disorders, which are tied very strongly to allostatic load. One of the things we know is that, for example, in terms of vaccinations, that vaccinations are much less effective. This is for anybody when a person is under a lot of stress, okay? Now, if you're under continual stress, it means it might be a partial reason why the susceptibility to COVID was so much higher among people who were identified as Black Americans. It also has cognitive effects. There's depression, there's impaired cognitive functioning. It's also associated with shortened lifespan of premature deaths. I'm going to digress for a moment. The first story we tell in the book, there was going to be a quiz and ask you what's the first story we tell in the book, but I'm not going to do that, is about a great study was done by, I believe, 3 Wayne State physicians dying before their time, okay? That's the first story we tell, because what that study was about was showing that a large part of the decline in the population of Detroit over a period of about 20 wasn't because, obviously, there was white flight, there was everything else, but a significant portion of it was because Black men were dying young, okay? And when you compare the mortality rates for Black men of the same age in Detroit or Wayne County to the rest of the state, the difference, the disparity is huge, okay? So premature deaths are a product of allostatic load. There are also epigenetic effects, mainly faster biological aging. Trust me, it's faster by. I'm not going to go in and talk about telomeres in my limited time. You could help me with that, couldn't you, Chris? Okay. So that's the first path. Let's move to the second path, which involves unhealthy environments. Okay. So what we know, you live in and around Detroit, so I'm going to say something that'll come as a surprise to nobody that is either here or is watching me on Zoom. America is a highly segregated country. Most Americans live surrounded by people who look like them. In Detroit, I can't remember, there were 60 or 70% of the people in Detroit would have to move where they live to achieve racial integration, residential integration in Detroit. And Detroit it's up there. Milwaukee's worse, okay? Now, a lot of people say, well, I just prefer to live near people who look like me. And that's true. But if this is another thing that all of a sudden we realized we had to go back and look at history to, well, why is this the case? For most of the 20th century, it was a policy of the federal, state, and local governments that if they were going to build housing, which the federal government did in great numbers, that housing had to be segregated. The federal government in formal documents said, we will put these huge public housing projects, which is a disaster. We'll put these in areas where there will not be racial strife, which meant they put ones for Black people in Black neighborhood areas with Black neighborhoods, and segregate. Also, the government substantially underwrote all white housing. You know, Levittown specifically prohibited. The government underwrote all those mortgages. Levittown specifically prohibited, and the government insisted on this, that they not allow Black people to live in any of the Levittowns. Okay, this is post World War II. And then private developers and banks. We'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. In the real estate industry, very purposely and actively created segregated neighborhoods. Where were these neighborhoods? They were in locations where other groups didn't want to live. They were under-resourced and physically isolated by local governments. There's another example in Detroit. They're tearing down, I understand, 375, right? And the reason why they're tearing it down is they built 375 to keep the Black and white neighborhoods separated. In one housing development, the government said they would fund it only if they built a wall between the Black neighborhood and the white neighborhood. So the interstate system in the United States, which came in the 50s and 60s, was used as a means to physically isolate Black communities from white communities. And then they were denied the private capital to improve neighborhoods. This is known as redlining. I think most of you are familiar with redlining. I realized this afternoon I had a color version of this, but too late. The really dark areas in this are the areas that were redlined in Baltimore in 1935. Literally what the government would do, they'd say, we'll underwrite your loan, private loans to this area, unless if they're green, but if they're red, they're indicated red, we will not let capital come into that, okay? This was 1935. In the book, we point out in 2020, these neighborhoods are still dramatically under-resourced. They're much lower socioeconomic status, and the health status of these neighborhoods is significantly less than the predominantly white or integrated areas that surround them. So redlining was a real thing. And actually, as something personal, the neighborhood where that's 25, no, that's not 25 minutes. Oh, God, I'm really lying. I'm going to stop it. I'm going to go. Okay, I'm going to go much faster. I'm sorry, that's what happens to me. The neighborhood where Michael's parents met and where I grew up was redline. Okay, the health effects go there are numerous health dangers and which result in greater mortality, more preterm and low weight births, for example. Okay, this is a map that I would ask Michael to identify, but I'm running short on time. Do you know what that is, Michael? It's the L.
Yes, L.
It's L, okay. This is an L stop. Washington Park is an L stop that is predominantly Black neighborhood. The one in the loop, what we call the loop, is a predominantly wealthy white neighborhood. They're about 1.5 miles apart. The difference in lifespan is 16 years. Okay, and that's not unique to Chicago. Okay, let's talk about healthcare, and I'll try and make this very quickly. The historical background, I'm not going to go through each one of the points, is simply that the racism that permeated America from its founding to the United States and its now was an integral part of American medicine. We know about the medical experiments. Less well known is the influence of eugenics, active eugenics, which was intentionally designed to limit the procreation of people of color in the United States. There was widespread forced generalization of Black women. Before 1964 and 1965, there was an exclusion of Black patients from mainstream medical care. There was the exclusion of Black people from medical professions. The AMA didn't really start accepting Black physicians until about 1966 or so, okay? What's the legacy? Open and malevolent racism has largely gone from healthcare, but it has left things like greater mistrust, poor quality care, and inappropriate use of medical diagnosis influenced by racists on this. This quote here I am going to read, and I'll take a few minutes more, but I'm getting close to being done. This was a jam of podcasts that came out in 2021, okay? And they had two distinguished JAMA editors talking about racism and medicine. You can read the quote, okay? JAMA pulled the podcast 2 days later. I have a link to it, but you can't find it. These guys, he and the other guy resigned from JAMA, and the editor of JAMA that did this was forced to resign as well. Okay, so what do we know about systemic racism? There's unequal access to medical care. Okay, there is still de facto segregation of healthcare facilities. The healthcare facilities that serve predominantly Black patients are underfunded, fewer staff, they're low quality, poor safety. There's a dramatic underrepresentation of Black physicians. Lauren Hamill, in a piece that she did for JCO, they documented this among oncologists. Okay, and there's an inappropriate use of race in diagnosis. This has become fairly common knowledge: kidney function, heart disease, lung capacity, and race bias occurs in supposedly race-neutral algorithm. This one I'm going to try to explain very quickly. Who knows if that'll actually happen. During the time of the COVID pandemic, hospitals use a large number, use an algorithm to decide who are the patients that need the greatest amount of treatment, okay? Because they're going to get special care, all right? And so this is a completely race-neutral algorithm. It's widely used, okay? Using this algorithm, Black patients needed to have 26% more illnesses than white patients to be considered high risk. What I've tried to indicate here is this is how many diseases Black people would need to get into the special program, and this is how many diseases white patients would need. Did they intend to do that? Was that set out with racial intentions? No. It was because they ignored the fact that the major predictor they were using was previous expenses on medical. I'm almost done, Michael. Okay. And finally, individual racism. Okay, there's explicit, overt. We talk about implicit racial bias. Remember, implicit is not explicit. Okay. High bias physicians, this is work that we began at Karmanos, has been replicated, more verbally dominant, spend less time with patients, are less warm, patient-centered, supportive, and these have negative effects on the outcomes. Okay, and I think this last slide, to skip the summary, I just want to say thank you, and I'm done.
Great.
The most important person to say thank you to is Terry Albrecht, my wife, as a reason why most of us are here. And then want to mention Dr. Simon, Dr. Gabriel, Dr. Heath, Dr. Shields, and Dr. Simon.
Great. Okay. Well, let's move
Sorry,
on.
it ran a little long.
No, it's perfect because we're going to continue the discussion in the next half hour, and we will continue ongoing after we're done here. So I want to do a quick shout out to Taylor Barrow, who unfortunately couldn't be here, and just to shout out one of our third-year medical student activists. She's a social worker. She's a third-year medical student, and she served as president of Black Student Association at Wayne State University. She participated on our recommendation at the Yale Cancer Center Diversity Enhancement Program. She's Detroit Equity Action Lab, and she's also on the Michigan Board of Clinicians for Climate Change. Okay, so now one of our two panel members here. EWAB is going to begin. EWAB Tedeschi is a candidate for the class of 2025, undergraduate degree in biochemistry, master's of science in applied life sciences. He's done work on clinical trials, disparities in accrual in California before he came here. Now he's working closely with Dr. Lauren Hamill on the area of financial toxicity, which affects a lot of our patients. So EWAB, please take your 6-ish minutes.
Okay, I'll go with I promise. Thank you so much for having me. Can you guys hear me okay? So at the last Health Equity Book Club, we covered the health gap covered by Sir Michael Marmot, who authored at that time. And in that panel, I kind of did a research exercise on the statistics in which I was able to make it to medical school as a Black man in America. And in those statistics, I factored in the ability, or rather the odds, of me either ending up dead by 25, in prison by 18, or even worse, without a family at the young age of 5. And incorporating that into the already present statistics of very, very low statistics of Black men in medicine, the odds of me even being here are a fraction of 0.0001%. So it's hard to say I beat the odds. In the third year of medical school, we really had the opportunity to work very closely with a ton of patients. And one of my patients that I interacted with, unfortunately, as also a Black man in America, he did not beat the odds the same way I did. For the sake of patient privacy, we'll call him Gabriel. He came into our family medicine clinic last month, 3 months fresh out of prison. He spent an 11-year sentence, 8 of which oftentimes he was found to be in solitary confinement. As a result of his sentence, he developed psychotic symptoms and was diagnosed in his time in prison with paranoid schizophrenia. We had a clinical psychologist show up on site and talk to him about the different treatment options available to him. But the entire time he was having that conversation with the psychologist, I was also in the room. He was looking me dead in the face the entire time, talking only to me and addressing only me. It kind of goes to say here that the clinical psychologist was a white man, and Gabriel didn't feel that he was really being seen. And when the clinical psychologist left, I talked to him because I was worried that he didn't really grasp everything that was going on, and more importantly, how we can best help him. I asked him, is everything okay? Do you understand what's going on, the plan for you, so to speak? And he said, I'll be honest, are you going to be my doctor in the next couple of months here? Because I need to come back and talk only to you. And I was confused. I clearly said medical student on my badge, so that wasn't a possibility. I explained the situation to him, and he said, despite the fact that this psychologist only really listened to me, I only felt seen by you and you only. And unfortunately, that is the reality in America, where Black patients want to be treated by Black physicians. And as it stands, Detroit is 78% Black, and the most recent class of Wayne State Medical School is only 8% Black. An embarrassment, honestly. If you extrapolate that nationally, you have 12% of the entire population are African Americans, and only 5 are Black in medicine. Again, another example of underrepresentation that we see in medicine, and the consequences that only compound itself to the existing examples that Dr. Penner described that are impacting Black Americans every day in healthcare. That being said, the book Unequal Health, in my opinion, serves as an excellent foundation for those who are uneducated, either from experience or from overall education in general, in terms of the disparities between white and Black Americans, or rather white and minorities in general in America, and how healthcare is also affected for them. I think the best part about all of this is that this book can be applied to anybody who reads it. And what I mean by that is, you have to begin to ask yourself, with 5% of all in medicine being Black, what do you do about the 95%? The question then becomes an exercise of allyship. And I think that's where Unequal Health really does its best job in providing that basis, that foundation of allowing physicians to better understand the system in general, how it negatively impacts Black Americans, and more importantly, how they can check their own internalized implicit biases that they may have been taught through either experience or unfortunately through education. Now, one of the biggest things that I like to do when I read a book is to skip towards the end, because I love spoilers, unfortunately. And so with Unequal Health, I did the very same, because I was really curious to see how we address these issues that have been so succinctly summarized by Dr. Penner and his group. And in reality, one of the biggest things that I found very moving was the impact of education and how we move forward in that regard to help Black Americans all throughout the country, whether in South Boston, Baltimore, or even Hayward, California, where I'm from, in terms of getting them either functionally literate and health literate, 2 very different things, but are both equally important. Back home, only a fraction of Black Americans in California can say that they are actually health literate, meaning if a doctor comes into the room and provides them information on their diagnosis and treatment plan, they actually understand what that all means. Lord knows, I am guilty of this as well. We have all thrown very complex words at patients, anticipating that they'll understand what we're actually saying. The amount of times I had to catch myself doing so, I can barely count. They're much more than just the days in the year, I'll say that much. And in the most humble way, I will say that it's important to address that all of us really do check our implicit biases day in and day out. Because at the end of the day, we truly don't really see ourselves checking ourselves on a team when we're working with the patient, unless we have that internal dialogue. And I feel like this book really does prime us to prepare for that conversation, either internally or within a team. Last, I do want to address the fact that I am the only medical student on this panel for today. Taylor, unfortunately, was supposed to be here with us, and I wanted to speak a little bit about her before I hop off of this mic here. Where I find myself somebody who's very actively interested and invested in improving health equity here in the country, and of course here in Detroit, and I'll be honest, even back home in California, I find myself one that doesn't like to rock the boat a lot. I am very much a people pleaser. That's just who I am. I was raised that way. And Taylor, thankfully, is my much more outspoken other half. I admire her a ton. You've heard a little bit about what she's involved in currently. And she, in my opinion, is never afraid to say her piece in terms of the advancement of health equity, either here or around the country. And so we really have to invest in this new generation. As educators, I'm looking at all of you here, and for those who may be working with the younger generation of healthcare professionals, it is on all of you to do your best to foster those who are interested in health equity and want to push that needle forward towards true equity in the country. So I thank you all for your time and appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Yoav, and we will hear from you again in a few minutes. Okay, so our second panel member is Dr. Paul, Professor, Department of Urology, Wayne State University, Karmanos, longstanding interest in health equity, prostate cancer research. Take the podium.
Let me correct that a little bit. I'm now in the Department of Oncology as opposed to urology, doing research, no longer doing surgery that I've done for 48 years. Lou, I've studied your book, not only read it, but studied it carefully, but similar to Ms. Washington's book on medical apartheid. And I found it interesting, informative, and somewhat depressing, obviously, because of who I am. But your premise was social, economic, and individual systemic racism and environment, not genetics and biology, are the major determinants of public health. However, I take exception with the fact that not genetics and biology, and that's what I want to address. But I do want to agree with you on most of the things you said. However, a significant part of your book was related to distrust of the white healthcare system that you didn't really go into in detail. I just want to mention a few things. The reason why that is because of the horrid things that have happened during slavery, where they operated on slaves without anesthesia because they thought they could tolerate the pain better, and treating the slaves with medicines just to test whether they would work in whites and vaccinations, et cetera. This distrust in the Black community exists today and is responsible for delayed diagnosis and delayed treatment because they're afraid to go to the healthcare system, predominantly white, because of what they're afraid of things that may happen to them. This distrust leads to lack of participation in clinical trials. And in North Carolina, they did an excellent study many years ago about health-seeking behaviors. They found that African Americans are afraid and will not go to a healthcare system because of what they will do to them. Whereas of whites, they were encouraged to go to a healthcare system because of what they will do for them. That conceptual dichotomy of health-seeking behaviors makes a big difference in the racial disparity in outcome. The other issue that you mentioned in your book was communication between the patient and doctor. This is key. For 300 years in slavery, the slaves were unable to learn how to read and write. And if they attempted to, they would be severely punished. And for 300 years, that happened. 200 years after, we have been trying to close the gap in terms of education. We've not succeeded. That's one of the reasons why there's so few African Americans in healthcare, physicians, nurses, et cetera. But in addition to that, the patient-doctor relationship is very difficult when the patient has poor education and the doctor has an extreme elevated, a higher education. There's a difference in the language spoken. It's almost a barrier to healthcare and obtaining a history of health. So that was the two things that I thought that was in your book that didn't really bring out. I wanted to make sure that that was there. Now, in terms of the education piece, the lack of education leads to the lack of knowledge. The lack of knowledge leads to the lack of access and power and money. That was planned because they wanted to make sure that African Americans were under control. So that has permeated every aspect in our society, including health. The issue of stress that you mentioned, I think, is very important because, and let me go back and say, I'm going to go back to that after I talk to you about the health issues and the cause for the health issues that we're seeing today. In 2010, we published in prostate cancer that the cancer grows faster in African American men than European American men. That's terms we use as opposed to black and white. And you'll understand that this has nothing to do with color in terms of these outcomes. But we looked at 1,000 patients who underwent, who had died from other causes. We did autopsy studies. We looked at men from 20 to 70 by decades. And we found that the cancer starts at the same time between African Americans and European Americans in the decade of 20 to 30. Approximately 10% African Americans and whites had the prostate cancer. These are small cancers that could not be identified. Between 20 and 30, it was about 15 to 20%. At age 40, the cancers became more aggressive in African Americans. The deaths began in African Americans at age 40, but not among European Americans. So if the cancer starts at the same time and reaches metastasis at a rate of 3 times greater, you have to assume that there has to be a genetic or biological basis for that. So that led me to think that I should look at the genetics. And what we found, what I was introduced to were 2 techniques, methodologies, bioinformatics and gene ingenuity analysis, network analysis, which identified driver genes that were more expressed among African Americans than European Americans. These were called pro-inflammatory cytokines and chemokines and transcripts that activate the androgen receptor. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. But and among European Americans, lipid metabolism genes were more expressed. Now, let me go on to 2015. It was reported that in Ghana, there was a higher incidence of prostate cancer there than in the United States. And recently, I've been reported that in Jamaica and Haiti, there's also a higher incidence of prostate cancer there. Also in breast cancer, triple negative breast cancer. In Nigeria, it's 50% of the women who have breast cancer have triple negative breast cancer. That's the one that's really lethal. In the United States, among African American women, it's only 30%. And among whites, it's 15%. So going back to the pro-inflammatory cytokines, in 2021, we reported that specifically tumor necrosing factor, we call it TNF, interleukin 1B, that's and IL-6, IL-8, those are all interleukins, CXCR4, or pro-inflammatory cytokine genes, and they initiate multiple biological pathways. And in cancer, the cancer cells, epithelial cells are stuck together initially. They have to come apart. This is called, excuse me, epithelial mesenchymal transition. I think I need some water here. Susan, right here. Epithelial mesenchymal transition. The cells that are stuck together, they have to come apart. That's the mesenchymal cells, and then they can invade and spread. Now, these pro-inflammatory cytokines that I mentioned initiates that process, and they're more expressed among African Americans. I don't want to know whether I mentioned that or not. But anyway, and in addition to that, the androgen receptor, which is like the estrogen receptor in females and breast cancer, is more activated by these 5 pro-inflammatory cytokines and chemokines. And they also undergo mutations that are responsible for castrate-resistant prostate cancer, which is the kind of cancers that cause death. These genes also activate VEGF, which is responsible for increased blood flow, angiogenesis, and also responsible for activating reactive oxygen species, which causes oxidative stress, which then causes DNA damage repair genes and mismatch repair genes. All of these result in mitochondrial mutation and cancer stem cells, which is key because cancer stem cells resist the chemotherapy and immunotherapy, and the patient ultimately dies, unfortunately, from advanced disease. Now, you mentioned chronic stress. That's very important because you're right that it's more prevalent among African Americans. What it causes, and you mentioned that, elevated cortisol, which is elevated cortisol for a long period of time, activates these pro-inflammatory cytokines, which you go through that same genetic and biological process. So this is extremely important that you understand. I'm not saying that these genetic factors are responsible for all of the racial disparity. I think what you've said is correct about the social issues and the political issues that are related to that. But we have to keep that in mind. Now, going back to my questions, I'm always asking why. What about Africa? Why are these cancers more advanced in Africa? Well, it's not all of Africa. As you know, Northern Africa has a different gene pool than Sub-Saharan Africa, but even in Sub-Saharan Africa, there's East Africa and West Africa, which I was talking to about our previous speaker, that's different genetically. The color's the same. That's why we can't talk about black and white in terms of health and health outcomes, because here we're dealing with two populations in Sub-Saharan Africa. So what's different about East Africa versus West Africa? West Africa is a rainforest. East Africa is a savanna. Savanna means tall grass, small trees. Rainforest is a thick vegetation. And in a rainforest, you have what are called infectious diseases, mosquitoes. And you all know about malaria and sickle cell. You have all the kinds of infectious diseases in West Africa. So what happens? These pro-inflammatory cytokines that have been talking about causing these cancers protect against infectious diseases, acute infectious diseases. And yes, it's been written that cancer is an autoimmune disease. Getting close to my end right here now. But so cancer is an autoimmune disease. So it causes progression of chronic disease, protects against acute disease. So it has selected a population in West Africa that's going to be more likely to have cancers because it's been naturally selected. The population's been selected. That's population genetics, that's hereditary. I don't have much time to go through that. I'm told I better stop. But I want to say that in Uganda, which is in Central Africa, found the same genes we found in African Americans, IL-6 and IL-8 causing aggressive cancer. So there's definitely a genetic basis, and I would recommend that you change the narrative of your book and discussion and include this as a factor causing racial disparity.
Maybe a second, but thank you so much. Why don't you have a seat here, because we're going to keep you up here and everybody in front. And please, why don't you come up also? So yeah, I'd like you to come up here. So the idea, and we have just 9-ish minutes, but that's okay. And we have, I think, 27 people online or so. Let's have a dialogue between author and panel members, and perhaps one of the panel members has a question for Dr. Penner. You're not heard as well online, but Dr. Penner is going to repeat the question. So let's see how that works. So, Ike, what is your question?
Well, no, I don't really have a question because I agree with everything you said. I understand what you said. I think you should just add the genetics and biology to his narrative in the future.
So what's your response to that?
First of all, I don't disagree with anything that Ike said. I know some of the research he's talking about. And clearly I give it passing, and we acknowledge the importance of genetics, and so I don't disagree. From a practical thing, there was how much could we cover and what is our area of expertise, because none of us are physicians or medical scientists. And the emphasis that we were trying to make in this was that the two things are not mutually exclusive at all. And we focused on the social determinants. And if in doing that, we suggested that genetics are not important and there are not differences in population groups, well, sorry about that. There is one place where I would like to mildly disagree with you. This came about in writing it. We have lines in the book and in everything I've written that Black patients' mistrust of medicine is not some paranoid fantasy. It's a rational, I don't know if we say it in the book, but I've said this in several articles. It's a rational reaction to this. And one of the reasons why there's a chapter on the history of racism in medicine was exactly that, because you can't discuss contemporary American medicine without talking about the long history of racism in medicine. It's funny. I consider myself a literate person. I read a lot of history. My politics go pretty far to the left, and I'd be working on a historical thing. I'd go up and say to my wife, Terry, I'd say, people know me how I would normally say this, but I'd say, I'm so damn mad. And she said, what are you mad about? I said, let me show you this. And it would be some just incredible obscenity that had been done to Black patients. And so we view that as part of it's the only thing I say is we didn't expect to, but then I said to my father, we got to write something about history, because this is part of the thing what we were talking about before about body snatching. You know, that was common.
Let me let you up. Do you have
Yeah, sure.
do you have a question? You have the author standing right here.
Well,
It's a bit of a departure from the current topic, so I
That's fine.
apologize.
That's
But-
okay. And we have one more online, but go ahead.
Got you. So one of my biggest questions is, as somebody who's currently in medical school, we have a lot of students, obviously, like I mentioned earlier, who aren't Black, and the question is
Okay.
how they can best utilize their education and tools that they've learned in the process of learning medicine to best become allies for their Black patients.
wow. I once wrote a book about racism, and I said, given that it's bad, what's the solution? And my answer was, if I knew, I wouldn't be stuck in Florida teaching psychology. My answer, I mean, that's an excellent question. I'm not. It is so complicated. I think medical training and the importance of what's taught in medical school is excruciatingly important. One of the things we know from work that my co-author Jack DeVideo has done in, I can't remember the name of this, long-term longitudinal study of medical students, the more that medical students can interact with people of color, the less implicit bias they show when they become physicians. And this is a study which has been going on for about 10 years. There's also, students can't do anything, but physicians can. I think I mentioned again before the talk, this analysis of the curricula in 11 medical schools is published in New England Journal of Medicine. We mentioned it in the book. The extent to which racial stereotypes are perpetuated, okay? For example, like this gets back to sickle cell disease is largely treated as a Black disease when we know that it's not a Black disease, as you pointed out. It's a disease that's associated with certain geographic location of certain populations, but it's treated as if this is something that comes with being Black, okay? And there's infinite number of things. If you go back and look, are the original articles in New England Journal of Medicine just talking about changes in the curricula, okay? And I don't know the urgency that what scares me is that those two quotes I had from the two prominent physicians really represent what leadership thinks. You know, so they can say the right thing, but when they say racism doesn't exist in medicine. I'm sorry, I'll make that short. Yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
You talked about historically marginalized groups.
Yes,
That meant simply that they're put on the margin while white individuals take the podium.
yes,
This is what's happening now.
yes,
Why don't you repeat the question?
yes, yes.
How do we make sure that individuals who are not in the place
Yeah.
of the lived experience? We need
Yeah.
we
Good.
need to have the space, tell their stories, to reclaim their voice,
Yeah.
and to be supported, ideally from behind. How can we make sure
Okay.
that they can have that, and we, if we are allies, do that in the ethical way? And that's my question for you. How do you define the ethical engagement?
And please repeat.
Yeah.
Summarize.
Let me try to summarize your question if I'm wrong. Essentially, what I'm saying is that the book was the two primary authors, myself and Jack DeVideo, always talk about this all the time. Yes, two wealthy old white guys talking about this problem, and it's our voices. And this was a constant struggle for us. We now is a Japanese national, and she and Brian has a very long history of involvement in public policy doing that. Let me give you one kind of covering, protecting myself. In the book itself, one of the things that we did was we have as many first-person narratives from people of color and the things that they've experienced at the hands of the medical, not only medical, but it's not only the celebrities, I did that to keep your interest, but we have a lot of first-person accounts of horrific things. So we were sensitive to that we had to have those voices there. I think given that I'm a privileged white person, and I wrote this book, I hope it's not hypocritical for me to say I completely agree with you. The voice, you know, and I'm not going to say that the voices are not there, because that's like saying, well, there's no qualified Black people. That's why we don't have them in medical school. It's a much more complicated thing. It's a lot to do with economics. I don't know the answer to that question. What I know is that I completely agree with the sentiment of the question.
I have to challenge you with the pledge that when you have a space as a white person.
Yeah.
Speak,
Yeah,
that you take with you to learners. Where you can actually help them have a space, have on their resume that they led a panel with you,
Mhm.
season
Yeah.
author.
Well.
You can support them, sponsor them, as you can have, can occupy the space, and take people with you, you push them.
Yeah.
you can push them ahead.
if I was able to do that, he suggested that if I give a talk like this at some place, that I bring what I'm going to call minoritized groups. Okay, that is, they've been made a minority, so that wouldn't simply just be people of African ancestry. That would be Hispanic. That would be people from the Middle East. I mean, you know, and any group that's been marginalized, and bring them with me to be, I think the term you used, learners. Were I able to do that, I don't give many talks anymore. I think that's an excellent suggestion. Anything else I say would I very strongly I'm really aware of the sentiment that you're expressing. You know,
Yeah, but, you know, actually, our time has run out, and perhaps each of our participants, our panelists, as well as the speaker, and I like to think of us all, actually, when I'm sitting in front of the patient, and I'm thinking of this book club, we're all at the same table. At least that's what I imagine, that we're all at the same table. And there's a number of us that do equity work and give talks, and your statement could apply to me as well, or to some of my colleagues in the audience. So I think this is a really nice take-home lesson. But I was going to say, perhaps any of them could have given that hour discussion here, but the time is always short. I know there is a genetic-based conference coming after us, and so I don't want to take up their space. But I'd like to thank each of you. And again, we send our best to Taylor. We will hear from her again. And of course, Iwa, Dr. Powell, Dr. Penner, Lou Penner, Ike Powell, you know, we're Michael Simon, we're people, you know, the
That's
doctor
right.
part is just
Right.
part of it.
right.
Okay, so thank you also to the audience and to the audience.
Thank you for inviting me.